We've all been there, driving down a lonely highway in the dead of night, the fuel gauge dipping dangerously low. You spot a gas station up ahead, a flickering neon sign buzzing in the darkness. You pull in, thinking it's just another routine stop. But what if it isn't? What if the station isn't supposed to be there? What if the cashier has been dead for years? What if something is watching you from the shadows, and it doesn't want you to leave? Some gas stations sell more than just fuel. Some sell fear. And once you step inside, you may never step out again. Turn off the lights, turn up the volume, and get ready. Because these 5 creepy gas station horror stories will make you think twice before stopping for gas at night. Let's begin if you dare. It was nearly 2 a.m. when Rick, the night shift clerk at the lonely gas station, noticed the man standing by pump 4. The cold winter air bit at his skin as he peered through the dirty window, squinting at the dark figure. The man had been there for over an hour, unmoving. His head was tilted slightly forward, and his eyes, dark, empty pits, were fixed on the convenience store. Rick couldn't make out much more. The streetlights barely lit the pump area, casting long shadows across the pavement. And then something strange happened. The security cameras flickered, a brief electrical hiss that made Rick's stomach tighten. He stared at the flickering screens, trying to zoom in for a better look, but the footage only distorted further. His hands hovered over the keyboard as his pulse quickened. It felt wrong, like the man wasn't supposed to be there. Rick hesitated, his breath fogging the air in front of him. "Need help, sir?" Rick called from the door, trying to sound confident. His voice cracked, betraying his unease. The man didn't respond. Rick stepped outside, the chill biting into his skin, but he couldn't take his eyes off the figure. The man stood perfectly still, his face pale, skin stretched too tight over his bones, like something wearing human skin in the wrong way. His clothes were tattered, the kind of thing someone would wear if they hadn't changed in years. But there was something wrong about him. The silence in the air made Rick's heart beat faster. He blinked and turned back to the store, glancing at the coffee machine. That's when he saw him again. The same man, but this time he was inside the store, by the coffee machine. Still, motionless. The door had never opened. Rick's blood ran cold, his feet rooted to the spot. He stumbled backward toward the door, unable to tear his eyes away from the figure in the store. His pulse was deafening in his ears, but when he turned to look at the door again, the man wasn't there. The store was empty. He could feel the weight of the man's eyes on him, as if the figure was still watching, waiting. Rick ran inside and locked the door. The bell over the counter jingled, but the man wasn't anywhere. Not by the coffee machine. Not by the counter. Not anywhere. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Rick's hand trembled as he grabbed the phone to call for help. But before he could press a single button, the doorbell rang again. He turned, already knowing what he'd see. The man was back outside, standing at pump 4, just as still and silent as before. Rick's mind raced. He couldn't understand it. Couldn't explain it. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of there. But every time he tried to step outside, the man was there. Always at pump 4. Always waiting. It was as if Rick had stepped into a nightmare, one that looped over and over again, trapping him in its grip. Before he knew it, Rick's feet led him to the back of the store. The small employee lounge was tucked behind the shelves of snacks and sodas. He sat down, his heart still pounding, trying to catch his breath. The fluorescent lights hummed above, but it was all he could do to stay awake. The man at pump 4. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. Just as he thought he was beginning to calm down, there was a soft knock on the door. Rick froze. He knew who it was. "Rick?" A voice called from the other side. It was his manager, Greg. Rick took a shaky breath and forced himself to answer. Yeah, I'm here," he said, his voice weak. The door swung open and Greg stepped inside. His face was puzzled, his brow furrowed. "What's wrong with you?" Greg asked. "You've been acting strange for hours." Rick opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could he explain? How could he tell Greg about the man who never left? The man who stared at him with those empty, hollow eyes? He didn't have to say anything. Greg's eyes shifted, and he stared at the clock on the wall. It read 2 a.m. Rick didn't have to look. He knew what would happen next. The doorbell rang. Greg froze, his eyes flicking toward the door. It rang again. And then, just like that, the man was outside. At pump 4. Greg's face paled. His lips parted, as if to say something, but nothing came out. He stepped back, his hands trembling. Rick could only watch as the figure moved, slowly but purposefully. The man approached the door, and for a moment, Rick could swear that he saw the man's lips twitch into a smile. A smile that never reached his eyes. The air in the store felt thick, like it was closing in on him. He reached for the door to bolt it, but the moment his hand touched the handle, a cold gust of wind blew through the cracks in the walls. The man was inside, without a sound, without opening the door. Rick turned to Greg, his face pale, but Greg wasn't there anymore. The man was standing behind him. Rick's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't dare turn around. He knew what he would see. The man reached out, his cold, lifeless fingers brushing Rick's neck. It felt like death itself was touching him. And then everything went black. The next night, the new clerk arrived, a kid named Jimmy, fresh out of high school. It was 2 a.m. when he noticed the man by pump 4. Just like Rick had before. The man had been there for over an hour, unmoving, staring at the convenience store. The security cameras flickered. David and Lisa were lost. The desert stretched out in every direction, a vast sea of sand and heat that seemed to never end. Their car had sputtered to a stop miles ago, and now the engine refused to turn over, no matter how hard David tried. The sun had long since disappeared, leaving the night air thick with dust and the weight of silence. There were no other cars, no houses, nothing. The GPS was useless. No cell service. They were truly alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere. David wiped his brow, frustration boiling over. This is ridiculous. We should have reached a town by now. Lisa, staring out at the darkness, tried to keep her voice steady. Don't worry, we'll figure something out. But there was nothing to figure out. They were running low on gas, and there was no sign of civilization for miles. Just as David was about to give up, something appeared on the horizon. A small, flickering light in the distance. A gas station. It wasn't much, just a single pump standing alone by the side of the road, the station barely visible behind it. But it was a sign of hope. Is that a gas station? Lisa asked, squinting into the distance. I think so, David replied, his voice low with disbelief. Let's just hope they have gas. He gunned the engine and steered the car toward the station, tires kicking up dust behind them. As they pulled up, a man shuffled out from behind the station's counter, his hunched back a silent testament to years of hard labor. He was old, his skin thin and pale, his face lined with wrinkles. His eyes, though, were the strangest part. They darted around, like a trapped animal looking for an escape. David and Lisa stepped out of the car, unsure of what to say. The air felt wrong here, thick with a strange tension. The man's hands were trembling as he reached for the nozzle, his gaze never settling on them for long. You shouldn't be here, the man said, his voice raspy and distant. Lisa laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. We're just here for gas. We're a little lost, that's all. The old man didn't respond. He simply filled the tank, his movements slow and deliberate. There was something about the way he moved that made Lisa's skin crawl. She kept glancing around, half expecting to see something, or someone, watching from the dark desert. When the tank was full, the man stood back, his gaze still flickering nervously toward the horizon. Go. Now. Before it smells you. Lisa and David exchanged confused glances. Before what smells us? David asked, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and shuffled back toward the station, vanishing into the shadows. The couple didn't know what to make of it. Still, they didn't question it. They just wanted to leave, to get as far away from that strange place as possible. Thanks, Lisa said, sliding into the car. David didn't say anything. He simply started the engine, and they sped off down the highway, leaving the gas station behind them. The further they went, the more the uneasy feeling in their stomachs grew. Lisa turned around to look behind them, her gaze catching the dim light of the station in the rearview mirror. But when she looked again, it was gone. The road was empty. "David," she said, her voice suddenly shaky. "Where did it go?" David frowned, glancing into the mirror. There was nothing behind them. Not a trace of the gas station, not a single light. Just the endless stretch of desert, empty and dark. "It's not there," he said, his voice filled with unease. Lisa's hands clenched the seat as her mind raced. That's impossible. We just saw it. We were there." But David didn't say anything else. He just pressed the gas pedal harder, trying to put as much distance between them and that strange place as possible. But then, something else caught their attention. At first, it was faint, a faint, unpleasant odor wafting through the air. Something rotten. Something wrong. Lisa frowned, her nose wrinkling in disgust. "Do you smell that?" David nodded, glancing around. "Yeah, what is that?" It wasn't just the smell of something decaying, it was something deeper. Something older. It was the kind of smell that made you feel like you were suffocating. Lisa looked at David, her throat tightening. "Where is it coming from?" David glanced in the rearview mirror, but he saw nothing but the empty stretch of highway. Just sand. Nothing. And then it hit them both at once, the feeling that they weren't alone. The car felt too small, too enclosed. The air too thick. David's heart started to race as his eyes flicked between the road and the mirror. Something felt off. Something wasn't right. And then he saw it. A shadow. At first, it was just a flicker, a trick of the light. But as the seconds ticked by, the shadow grew larger, more solid. It was coming from behind them, from the place they had just left. Lisa gasped. "What is that?" David's hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white as he pressed harder on the gas. "I don't know, but I don't want to find out." But it was already too late. The figure was there, just behind them, slowly gaining on the car. At first, it was just a tall, dark shape, its outline twisted and wrong. But as it came closer, Lisa's blood ran cold. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and thin like something stretched too far, its limbs bent in impossible ways. Its face, it was a twisted grin, too wide for its skull, its eyes black and hollow, staring with a hunger that made her blood freeze. David slammed his foot on the accelerator, the car surging forward, but the figure didn't slow down. It was closing in, its long, skeletal fingers reaching out toward the car. And that's when they heard it, the low, rasping sound. A laugh. A horrible, dry laugh that echoed across the empty desert. David's heart raced in his chest as he fought the wheel, trying to keep the car steady. Faster. Faster. But the creature was getting closer. Its grin stretched wider, its fingers brushing against the back of the car. Then, just as they thought it was too late, David turned the wheel sharply. The car swerved off the road, tires skidding across the sand. They tumbled down an embankment, the world spinning around them. When the car finally stopped, David and Lisa were breathless, their bodies bruised but alive. They didn't dare look back. The desert was silent again. And when they finally mustered the courage to get out of the car, there was nothing behind them. No sign of the creature. No gas station. Just the endless, empty desert. And the smell, faint but still there. Something rotten. Something that wasn't there before. Danny had been on the road for hours, the monotony of endless asphalt and the hum of his truck's engine grinding at his nerves. His eyes were heavy, and the smell of stale coffee still clung to him from the last stop. He needed a break, something to stretch his legs, so when he saw the gas station up ahead, he pulled off the highway without a second thought. It wasn't much, just a small, rundown place with flickering lights and a single pump. The kind of station that had seen better days but was still open, still selling gas at some ridiculous price. He parked his rig, grabbed his jacket, and walked inside to stretch his legs and maybe get a snack. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the cold air inside was a relief after the hot, dry desert outside. The gas station had a small convenience store, the usual snacks and drinks, and a single restroom in the back. As Danny wandered toward the back, he noticed something strange. There, hanging on the bathroom door, was a sign. A handwritten sign that read, "Do not remove tape." Danny frowned. He couldn't see what was so important about the sign, but the more he thought about it, the more curious he became. The bathroom mirror was covered in duct tape, thick strips running from one side to the other, crisscrossing in a pattern like some kind of warning. "Superstitious nonsense," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. He didn't believe in any of that crap. It was just a mirror. With a shrug, he reached up and peeled the tape off. The sound of the adhesive pulling free echoed in the small bathroom, followed by a faint whistling noise, almost like the wind, though there was no wind outside. As the last piece of tape came off, Danny took a deep breath and stepped in front of the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He'd been driving for too long, pushing through the fatigue just to make it to the next stop. But then something odd happened. His reflection smiled. A wide, disturbing smile. And Danny didn't smile. His heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his chest. His reflection grinned again, and then with slow, deliberate movements, it stepped forward. Danny took a step back, his mouth dry, his body frozen in place. His reflection wasn't just mimicking him anymore. It was moving independently, moving like it was alive, like it had its own thoughts, its own will. For a split second, Danny thought it was just a trick of the light, some illusion, maybe a result of his tired mind playing games on him. But the reflection kept coming forward, step after step, its grin widening until it was almost unnatural. And then it reached out, its hand moving toward him. No, through the mirror. Danny's instincts kicked in. He spun around, heart pounding, and bolted toward the door. The cold air rushed against his face as he threw it open, stumbling into the gas station, gasping for breath. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. He turned to look behind him, but there was no sign of the thing from the mirror. Nothing was following him, just the dim lights and empty shelves of the store. But then, something even stranger happened. Every single person in the gas station stopped what they were doing. The cashier behind the counter, the two truckers sitting by the window, the young woman stocking shelves. They all turned to look at him. And it wasn't just their eyes that stopped him cold. It was their faces. Every single one of them had his face. The same eyes, the same tired look, the same set of jaw, the same scruffy beard. Danny's breath hitched, his chest tightening. "What the hell?" he whispered under his breath, taking a step back, his head spinning. The cashier's mouth twitched, as if he was going to speak, but didn't. The two truckers just stared at him, their faces expressionless. The woman didn't even blink. Everything in the room felt wrong. Danny's feet felt like lead as he backed toward the door, his hand shaking as he reached for the handle. He had to get out of there. He had to get away from whatever this was. But just before he stepped outside, a voice from the back of the room made him freeze. "Are you okay?" It was the cashier, his voice low and steady, but there was something odd about it. Something too calm. The man's lips barely moved, like the words were coming from somewhere else. Danny opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. There had to be some explanation. He forced himself to take a deep breath and stepped outside, the door slamming shut behind him. He couldn't look back. He couldn't risk seeing what was waiting for him in that place. His truck was still there, waiting. He climbed in, heart racing, hands shaking. He started the engine without a second thought, slamming the gear shift into drive. He didn't stop to look in the rearview mirror. He just drove. Fast. The night passed slowly, the dark road stretching endlessly before him, but he couldn't shake the image of their faces. His face. The faces of everyone in that gas station, staring at him with those blank expressions. The next morning, Danny found himself back on the road, exhausted but alive, his mind replaying the events from last night like a bad dream. But as the hours passed, and he got further from the gas station, the fear began to fade, replaced by the reality of being just another trucker on the road. It was nothing, he told himself. Just some weird moment of tiredness, stress, and a crazy coincidence. But when he pulled into another gas station later that day, he couldn't help but notice something strange. There on the bathroom door was a new sign, a handwritten sign that read, "Do not remove tape." And above it, a fresh layer of duct tape had been placed over the mirror. Danny froze. His stomach turned. He stepped closer, his hand hovering over the door handle, but he didn't open it. He couldn't. His mind flashed back to the faces, the grinning reflection. The gas station clerk didn't say anything, didn't ask any questions. He just made sure the door was locked before Danny could enter. "Better leave that tape alone," the clerk said, his voice just a little too calm. Danny didn't say a word. He just got back in his truck and drove away. And the next time he passed that gas station, the mirror was still covered. And the sign still read, "Do not remove tape." Some warnings, it seemed, were better left unheeded. There was a gas station deep in the woods, tucked away on an old, forgotten stretch of highway. The kind of place you only found if you were lost or desperate. The lights flickered like they might give out at any moment, and the place always smelled like oil and something old, like it had been there for decades. But there was one thing that stood out about it. One thing that truckers couldn't stop talking about. Pump 6. It was the only working pump at the station. And no matter how much gas you took from it, no matter how long it ran, it never seemed to run dry. Some said it was a blessing. Others whispered that it was a curse. Either way, everyone who passed through the place had heard the rumors, and most truckers stayed well clear of it. Hank was different. He wasn't one to believe in stories or superstitions. He'd been on the road long enough to know that there was always a logical explanation for things, no matter how strange they seemed. So, when he pulled into the station on a cold, overcast afternoon, he didn't think twice about filling up his tank from Pump 6. The attendant was a pale man, thin and sickly looking, with eyes that seemed too deep for his face. He didn't say much, just watched Hank as he started fueling his truck. But Hank was a trucker, and truckers were always thinking ahead. He wasn't just going to fill his tank. He had a plan, a test. He grabbed 3 empty gas cans from the back of his truck and placed them next to the pump. The nozzle clicked as the gas started flowing into the first can. The station attendant didn't move, just stared at him from behind the counter. Hank watched the pump as it filled up. He kept an eye on the meter, waiting for it to hit empty. But it didn't. It just kept running. 3 cans later, Hank pulled them off the pump and set them aside, but he wasn't finished. He grabbed 5 more cans from the back of the truck and placed them around the pump, his curiosity burning. As he continued to fill them, the pump never slowed down, never faltered. The station attendant shifted slightly, his face unreadable. Hank filled 10 cans in total before he finally stopped, stepping back to admire his haul. That was enough to make a decent profit on the side if he ever needed it. But there was still something strange in the pit of his stomach. He glanced over at the attendant. The man didn't say a word, but his eyes were wide, his face tight with something like fear or regret. He stepped out from behind the counter, his shoes making a soft shuffle on the cracked floor. "You took too much," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hank froze, feeling a chill run down his spine. He had taken more gas than most people would ever think to ask for. He'd never seen a pump like this before. But it was just gas, right? Nothing to be afraid of. He shrugged, trying to brush it off. "It's just gas, old man. I'm just filling up for the road." The attendant stepped closer, his grip like iron as he grabbed Hank's arm. "You took too much. It's not just gas. You need to leave. Now!" Hank pulled his arm away, irritated but unsure. There was something about the man's eyes that made him uneasy, like he'd seen too many things he shouldn't have. All right, Hank said. "I'm done here anyway." He tossed the nozzle back into the pump and made his way to his truck, the cans of gas stacked in the bed. The attendant didn't move, didn't say another word. Hank started the truck and drove off, the engine growling to life beneath him. He wasn't going to let some old man scare him off, not when he had so much fuel. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. As Hank drove down the empty road, the wind howling outside his window, he noticed that the truck was beginning to sputter. At first, he thought it was just the engine warming up, but the sputtering got worse. Then, the truck started to slow down. He pressed his foot down harder on the pedal, but the truck didn't respond. "Come on," Hank muttered, his frustration growing. "Not now." But it was no use. The engine coughed one last time and then stalled, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere. He slammed his fists on the steering wheel, cursing under his breath. The road was empty, nothing but the dark woods around him and the fading light of the day. There wasn't a house in sight. No other cars. Just trees and more trees. He got out of the truck, popping the hood to see if something had gone wrong with the engine. Nothing. It was fine. There was nothing mechanically wrong. The engine was running smoothly before it stalled, and yet here he was, stuck on this deserted stretch of road. Hank slammed the hood down, frustration turning to unease. He should have listened to the old man. There was something wrong with that pump. He turned around to face the woods, feeling a prickle of dread crawl up his spine. That's when he saw it. A shape. Tall. Too tall. Moving through the trees at the edge of the woods. At first, it was just a shadow, something barely visible through the thick trees. But it was coming closer. Slowly. Stepping forward with long, deliberate movements. Hank's heart skipped a beat as the shape emerged from the trees, and his stomach churned. It was like nothing he'd ever seen. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its body was hunched, twisted. Its face was pale and elongated, with too many teeth. The kind of teeth that made Hank's blood run cold. It didn't make a sound, but Hank could feel its eyes on him. It was hungry. It was waiting. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know if it was the creature or the fear itself that pushed him, but he ran as fast as his legs could carry him. The woods seemed to close in around him, the trees blocking out the sky. He stumbled, his foot catching on a rock, but he didn't stop. And just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. Hank couldn't explain it. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, like it had melted into the night. His breath came in ragged gasps as he slowed to a stop, looking around. The road was still empty. The creature was gone. But there was something else. The air around him was thick with the smell of gasoline, cloying and suffocating. He glanced over his shoulder, his heart racing again. His truck was still stalled, sitting there like it had been for hours. And yet, there was still something strange about the air, something that made him feel like he wasn't alone. Behind him, deep in the woods, a faint sound echoed through the trees. The sound of something moving, something that wasn't human. Hank didn't wait around to find out what it was. He sprinted back to his truck, his hands shaking as he tried to get it started again. It didn't work. And so Hank sat there, waiting for whatever came next, his mind filled with the image of that thing, tall, hungry, with too many teeth. At the gas station, Pump 6 kept running. Charlie had worked the graveyard shift at the gas station off Route 66 for over a year now. It wasn't much, but it paid the bills, and he didn't mind the quiet. The late nights didn't bother him. Just him, a few trucks passing by, and the hum of the neon lights flickering above the pumps. It was easy work, the kind that let his mind wander, and that was how he liked it. Except for one thing. Every night, without fail, at exactly 3:13 a.m., the bell above the door would jingle. Charlie didn't know why, but it always happened. No one ever came in. The parking lot was empty, and the road outside was dark, just a stretch of asphalt disappearing into the desert. But the bell would ring clear and sharp, breaking the silence. Charlie had checked the security cameras more times than he could count. Every single time, the footage was the same, empty. Nothing. Just the dim light of the station and the stillness of the night. The bell would ring, and that was it. It had started to unnerve him. It wasn't the kind of thing that made you want to stick around in the dead of night. But Charlie told himself it was just a glitch, just some trick of the wind, maybe. Nothing to worry about. Until one night when something changed. It was a little after 3 a.m. when Charlie heard it, the sound of footsteps. Heavy, wet. He froze, his hand halfway to the cup of stale coffee he had been sipping. The sound came from the far side of the store, where the aisles of snacks and drinks lined the walls. It was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet across the linoleum floor. Wet footsteps. Charlie's heart started to pound in his chest. He stood still, listening, his breath shallow. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right in front of the counter. "Hello," Charlie called out, his voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" There was no answer, just the thick silence that followed. He swallowed hard and looked around the corner, but the store was empty. Nothing. Then, a voice came out of the darkness. "Where's my change?" It was soft, almost a whisper, like the sound of someone speaking through water. The words didn't make sense. There was no one there. But the voice had a weight to it, a coldness that made the hairs on the back of Charlie's neck stand up. His eyes shot to the counter, his hands shaking as he grabbed the register, his fingers fumbling to unlock it. The store was empty. He knew that. He'd checked the cameras. He was alone. But something was there. He forced the words out, his throat dry. There's no one here." There was a soft slap on the counter, like something wet had pressed against it. Charlie jerked back, his breath catching in his throat. When he looked down, there was a handprint on the counter. A wet, dark handprint. His heart raced. His mind screamed at him to leave, to get out of there, but his feet wouldn't move. He was frozen, staring at the handprint, the air thick with the scent of something rotten, like dying flowers. The footsteps had stopped, but Charlie didn't dare look up. He couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to face whatever was standing in front of him. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, until finally, he couldn't take it anymore. His feet moved on their own, and he backed away from the counter, eyes still fixed on the handprint, his hands still shaking uncontrollably. It wasn't until he reached the door that he snapped out of his trance. He didn't think. He didn't look back. He just grabbed his things and ran. The next morning, Charlie didn't go back to the gas station. He didn't call in, didn't leave a note. He just didn't show up. He didn't know what he'd seen that night, whether it was real or something his tired mind had made up. All he knew was that he was done. He couldn't work there anymore. The gas station found a new clerk the same night. A young guy named Greg, who didn't mind working the night shift and who was eager to get started. Greg showed up fresh and wide-eyed with a big smile. He didn't know about Charlie's weird experience. He didn't know about the bell, the footsteps, or the voice. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the bell over the door jingled. Greg glanced up, expecting to see someone walk in, but the store was empty. The lot was still. Nothing had changed. He shrugged, assuming it was just another quirk of the station, just like Charlie had probably thought. But as Greg moved behind the counter, he stopped. A wet handprint was on the counter. It wasn't there a moment ago. His heart skipped a beat. He looked around the store, his eyes scanning the aisles, the empty parking lot outside, but there was nothing. No one. The bell rang again, and a whisper, soft and cold, slid through the air. "Where's my change?" Greg didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the counter, his body frozen in place. His pulse was thundering in his ears, and the scent of rotting flowers filled the air. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the answer now. He wasn't the first. The handprint would always come back, and the voice would always whisper. And as the new clerk at the gas station off Route 66, Greg knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't be the last. The next morning, the handprint would still be there, and the bell would always ring at 3:13 a.m. The customer who wasn't there would always return.